Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of APA and Vice Chair of the Urbanism Division. And I will be one of the co-moderators for today's webcast. Today is Friday, October 30th, and we will hear the presentation, Planning for Flood Recovery and Long-Term Resilience. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown on your screen in bold. For your content questions related to the presentation, just type those in the questions box, also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the New York Upstate Chapter of APA. To learn more about all of our chapters, visit planning.org/chapters, and to learn about our divisions, visit planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, just visit our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, head to planning.org, log in, go to your dashboard, and the best way to find it is to select Activities by Provider, again, New York Upstate, and then today's title. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some of our recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. And for availability of that, just check out, again, our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available at the end of the presentation on our webcast webpage, again, at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker. Jamie Burchard-Thoman, AICP, is a senior planner at the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council in Rochester, New York, where she has been providing comprehensive planning support to a 9-county region for over 8 years. Jamie's focus areas are general municipal, water resources, and historic preservation planning. Water resources planning includes stormwater regulation assistance, watershed and floodplain management planning, and public communication and community outreach. She began her career with CAD GIS analysis at Dewberry in Fairfax, Virginia, where she worked on the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program contract, participated in FEMA's Public Assistance Program during active hurricane seasons, and the 2001 World Trade Center disaster. Other work experiences include environmental planning and cultural resource documentation on Long Island, New York. Jamie graduated from Mary Washington College in 2000 with a dual Bachelor of Arts in Historic Preservation and Geography, and Cornell University with a Master of Arts in Historic Preservation Planning in 2005. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jamie Burchard-Thoman.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everyone. This afternoon's webinar focuses on how communities can help plan for the future by incorporating the reduction of future risks for development and redevelopment. Stressors such as climate change and extreme weather necessitate the need to plan smarter, Communities need to avoid building or rebuilding in harm's way where future risks can be anticipated. Communities also need to be ready to act with recovery plans and to apply their mitigation and climate adaptation policies in the fast-moving post-disaster period. The rapid change brought on by a disaster requires an equally rapid and adaptable post-disaster recovery process, so communities are able to take advantage of opportunities to rebuild smarter by integrating mitigation into redevelopment. I'd like to begin with a summary of today's webinar's goals.
Hey, Jamie, before you go on, our sound quality is getting a little funky. I don't know if you're on a microphone or something, but if you could try to get closer to it. And you might want to try, if you're having trouble advancing to the next slide, try right-clicking your mouse and hitting next. Sometimes it gets stuck on that first one. So.
Okay, I just did. And are you still hearing me, or is it still kind of?
It's a little choppy. Are you on a microphone? I feel like we did do a test, everybody, and I swear she sounded great.
Uh-oh. I can try to increase the sound.
Okay. Just try to, whatever you're using, if you could just try to keep your head close to it. Thank you. And it looks like some folks don't have any problems, so I'm sure you'll be fine. Just try to keep close to the microphone.
Okay. I'm trying to get out of this, but it's just not letting me. Okay, I will continue. Sorry, everyone. And I will speak loud and slowly and very close to the microphone. Okay, so today's goals. We're going to be discussing the Emergency Operations Plan, Hazard Mitigation Plan, and the Recovery Plan, what the different components are, which the EOP, Emergency Operations Plan, identifies the departments and agencies designated to perform response and recovery activities and specifies tasks they must accomplish. The federally sponsored hazard mitigation plans are pre-event plans that address natural hazards, risks, and vulnerability, and identifying mitigation actions reducing potential disaster losses over time. And the recovery plan is a post-disaster plan comprising of policies, plans, implementation actions, and designated responsibilities related to expeditious and orderly post-disaster recovery and redevelopment, as well as long-term mitigation. Next, the American Planning Association's Model Recovery Ordinance outlines a foundation for local strategic action by which a community can organize to efficiently manage short and long-term recovery, either in advance of or after a disaster. The purpose of a Model Recovery Ordinance is to provide legal authority for actions commonly found useful in expediting recovery, together with emergency powers protecting public health and safety and fostering desired beneficial long-term recovery outcomes. Next, we'll review legislation that requires climate impacts be part of the planning, permitting, and funding process. The New York State Community Risk and Resiliency Act advances a number of important recommendations of the New York State 2100 Commission, which Governor Andrew Cuomo convened after Superstorm Sandy to develop more resilient infrastructure systems across the state. The Community Risk and Resiliency Act requires state agencies to consider future physical climate risks caused by storm surges, sea level rise, or flooding in certain permitting, funding, and regulatory decisions. We'll also review a summary of land use audits aimed at resilience. And we'll examine the floodplain regulation opportunities to increase resiliency by enacting regulatory standards that are more restrictive than the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, regulations. Lastly, we'll touch upon the Community Rating System program as a tool for establishing performance metrics and for the purposes of flood resiliency can serve as a baseline for objective related conditions that can be measured again in the future to determine if flood vulnerability has been reduced or efforts in flood recovery achieved. Before we move into the review of the emergency hazard mitigation documents, I'd like to take this opportunity and introduce participants to the role of regional planning councils. Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council is one of 9 locally created regional planning boards in New York State. We are located in West Central New York and bordered by Lake Ontario to the north, the Southern Tier region to the south, Syracuse and the Central New York region to the east, and the Buffalo-Niagara metropolitan area to the west. The New York State Association of Regional Councils represents 45 of the state's 62 counties. GFLRPC was established in 1977 by a joint resolution approved by its 8 original member counties, including Genesee, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Orleans, Seneca, Wayne, and Yates. Wyoming County was admitted in 1986. The council was organized under Articles 5G and 12B of the New York State General Municipal Law, which recognizes intermunicipal cooperation. Regional councils do not have the power to tax or to regulate. Our primary program components include local, regional, and water resources planning, regional economic development planning, and a data, technology, and resource center. My focus area is water resources planning, which includes federal Phase 2 stormwater regulations, participation with county water quality coordinating committees, stormwater and floodplain management planning, watershed planning, and watershed plan implementation. Moving on to the Emergency Operation Plan. Basically, which has several different purposes: to assign responsibility to organizations and individuals for carrying out specific actions at projected times and places in an emergency that exceeds the capability or routine responsibility of any one agency, such as a fire department. It sets forth lines of authority and organizational relationships and shows how all of those actions will be coordinated. It also describes how people and property will be protected in emergencies and disasters. It identifies personnel, equipment, facilities, supplies, and other resources available within the jurisdiction or by agreement with other jurisdictions for use during response and recovery operations. Lastly, it identifies steps to address mitigation concerns during response and recovery activities. In the nation's system of emergency management, and contrary to what many local governments believe, the local government must first act to address the public's emergency needs. Depending on the nature and size of the emergency, state and federal assistance may be provided to the local jurisdiction. The local EOP focuses on the measures that are essential for protecting the public, such as warning, emergency public information, evacuation, and shelter. The state has 3 roles. They assist local jurisdictions whose capabilities are overwhelmed by an emergency. They themselves respond first to certain emergencies, and they work with the federal government when federal assistance is necessary. When disasters threaten or strike a jurisdiction, people expect elected leaders to take immediate action to deal with the problem. The government is expected to marshal its resources, channel the efforts of voluntary agencies and private enterprise in the community, and solicit assistance from outside of the jurisdiction if necessary. In all states and in most localities, that authority is granted by statute or ordinance. The elected leadership in each jurisdiction is legally responsible for ensuring that necessary and appropriate actions are taken to protect people and property from the consequences of emergencies and disasters. In New York State, the local chief executive, which could be the county executive, a town supervisor, or village or city mayor, can declare a local state of emergency covering all or part of his or her jurisdiction, pursuant to 2B of the state executive law. Authority to undertake an EOP is provided by both Article 2B of State Executive Law and the New York State Defense Emergency Act. Moving on to the Hazard Mitigation Plan. The Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 amended the Stafford Act with two requirements for states. First, it required states to prepare multi-hazard mitigation plans in order to be eligible for post-disaster assistance. Second, it required states to prepare local hazard mitigation plans as a precondition for local government eligibility to receive hazard mitigation grants. They qualify the local jurisdiction for receipt of federal hazard mitigation grant program, flood mitigation assistant grants, and severe repetitive loss grants. Examples of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program helps implement hazard mitigation measures following a presidential major disaster declaration. The Flood Mitigation Assistance is providing flood hazard mitigation projects, plan development, and management costs. And the Severe Repetitive Loss Grants eliminates or reduces the damage to residential property by repeated floods. By requiring states and encouraging local governments to prepare hazard mitigation plans, the intent is to encourage more effective hazard mitigation projects, thereby reducing disaster losses. So think of an EOP as a standard operating procedure. Who is responsible for carrying out specific actions? It identifies the personnel, equipment, facilities, supplies, and other resources available, and outlines how all actions will be coordinated. The Hazard Mitigation Plan outlines mitigation actions, or the activities to reduce the loss of life and property from natural and/or human-caused disasters by avoiding or lessening the impact of a disaster. Also, the Hazard Mitigation Plan is required by FEMA through the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. There is no federal mandate for an emergency operation plan, although for many states it's highly recommended and/or required for state funding. So moving on to the recovery plan. While there may be provisions for recovery planning, such as Article 2B of New York State Executive Law, there has been less focus on this phase of emergency management, or perhaps more of a complexity to overcome, since recovery can include land use recommendations, such as new or amendments to zoning, subdivision, building, sanitary, or fire prevention regulations, and recommendations for economic development and community development, which becomes more of a local matter. For some states, this can be handled at the county level, but in New York State, this would fall to cities, towns, and villages via municipal home rule law. So it depends on state law and whether or not a local government has a certain power. Developing a post-disaster recovery plan requires envisioning the potential obstacles to reconstructing a community in a compressed timeline, not just rebuilding what was there prior to the disaster event, but redeveloping a more sustainable and disaster-resilient community, with participation from all stakeholders impacted by the disaster. A disaster can be an opportunity to increase the resilience and quality of development. The decision should be made before a disaster to which standards rebuilding will be held. There are distinct advantages for communities that take the trouble to plan for and assess their recovery needs ahead of an actual event. These are building a local culture of disaster awareness, providing a focus for pre-disaster exercises, establishing clear lines of responsibility, considering and reviewing financial needs, and assessing overall preparedness. So what you see on your screen is a copy of the Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation, which is through the APA. This is an updated manual with case studies based on the original 1998, the first guidebook for local planners confronting all types of natural disasters such as flood, earthquake, tornado, wildfire, and hurricane. And that document was called Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery and Reconstruction. So I encourage everyone to take a look at this document, and that web link is provided right there. Long-term recovery planning is similar to comprehensive planning in the breadth of topics that must be addressed, such as land use, infrastructure, and housing. Many different aspects of a community may have to be simultaneously restored or redeveloped, since each is dependent upon the others. All, however, should somehow revolve around a seventh concern, hazard mitigation, which should occupy a central role in any recovery plan. I'm going to focus on land use and reconstruction standards for purposes of floodplain management, regulation, and resiliency. So, examining land use and reconstruction redevelopment standards. In preparing a recovery plan, here are some questions to ask, and not necessarily needed to be put in a recovery plan, but in any form of an existing planning process that a community might have. Do building and land development regulations address post-disaster rebuilding? Actions should be undertaken as soon as possible to clarify exactly what policies and codes will be enforced during rebuilding, because a sense of certainty of what will be allowed before a disaster will lead to a smoother rebuilding process. Slight variations between different codes related to rebuilding standards could slow down recovery by making it more confusing for property owners to determine what they are allowed to build back, and for staff to ensure they are enforcing the correct standards. For example, in New York State, code enforcement officers are enforcing the New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code and Property Maintenance Codes of New York State. Yet, local governments have local chapters on unsafe buildings, building and development, fire prevention and building construction, flood damage prevention, and zoning. So making sure that your local codes match with the state codes is very important. How will permitting processes stand up to post-disaster pressures? Speed of permitting and inspection processes are important to the success of disaster recovery. Subjective decisions will slow the process and require more staffing. Inconsistent decision-making could jeopardize citizen confidence in governmental processes. If exact requirements can't be written into the policy or code, then provide for the ability to make emergency blanket variances after a major disaster, and make the plan for emergency variances known pre-disaster for properties owners' expectations. Does the community have a draft moratorium law? Moratoria and other forms of interim zoning controls are often needed to freeze development until a satisfactory final plan or regulations are adopted. The moratorium may be general, imposing a ban on all development approvals throughout the community, or specific to one land use or to a particular zoning district. For example, a moratorium can halt the review of projects currently before boards, acceptance of new development applications, such as site plan, subdivision, or special permit, and/or issuance of water and sewer connection permits. Are value thresholds established for rehabilitation versus reconstruction? Local officials and communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program must determine whether proposed work qualifies as a substantial improvement or repair of substantial damage. If work on building constitutes substantial improvement or damage, then structures must be brought into compliance with the NFIP requirements for new construction, including the requirement that the lowest floors be elevated to or above the base flood elevation, or the BFE. So In keeping with the first policy brought up, review local codes for consistency with the National Flood Insurance Program definition of substantial damage, which the cost of restoring the structure to its before damaged condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value before the damage occurred. Some communities may have a definition of a non-conforming use, which means a structure may not be renovated or structurally altered to an extent exceeding a certain percentage of the market value. So making sure those two definitions are compliant. The next two issues, will rebuilding be allowed in areas or prohibited in others? Has a value been established for public acquisition of private property? These next two issues will be discussed through an example project. GFLRPC is currently working with the Nature Conservancy and several communities in Western New York to help determine flood vulnerability and to reduce risk. In order to do this, we are using the digital Q3 flood zone data, which are derived from the flood insurance rate maps published by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, using local tax. How many structures are hazard area, SFHA, or which is also known as the annual transfer for the 100-year flood. Description. Finally, high risk are those structures built before the community's first flood map was issued, which is usually spelled out in the community's Floodplain Ordinance. This date can also be acquired by checking the Community Status Book report. Second, medium risk are those structures built before the 2-foot freeboard was established by the 2007 New York State Residential Code. Freeboard is a factor of safety usually expressed in feet above a flood level for purposes of floodplain management. Low risk are those structures built after the 2007 New York Residential Code. Currently, we are developing geographic information systems
Hey, Jamie,
to show which areas.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. You're having some audio problems. You're fading in and out pretty badly. I'm not sure if it's your internet connection or not. But if you wouldn't mind, let's just try to connect you to the telephone. Would you mind doing that?
Sure.
Okay. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that we don't have this problem again because you were fading pretty far out. If you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to take the controls back for a second so that you can do what you need to do. Everyone, you won't see my screen or anything like that. But Jamie, if you could go into your email where you clicked in to log in to go to webinar, there should be a phone number. So if you wouldn't mind calling into that phone number.
Not a problem.
Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Sometimes this happens. And Jamie, just let me know if you're having trouble finding that phone number.
so far?
I should have been more prepared. I could have printed out a reciting of the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, for everyone
I'm
for our
here.
little
I'm on the phone.
intermission.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on the telephone? Okay, so one last thing. I just need you to go to your audio panel and switch from microphone to telephone. It should be right next to your name.
Got it.
Yay! All right. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Now, is there a certain spot that I should go back to and reread for people?
It was just in and out for about a slide or two. I think some people it was fine and some people it wasn't. So just go ahead and pick up where you left off. And if anyone has any questions, for sure you can ask those at the end. And we'll also have a PDF of this in a recording, so you can always check back after as well. So go ahead and choose to show your screen when you're ready, and we can jump back in. Thanks for everyone's patience. And Jamie, you sound great now.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I will pick up discussing the graphic display of the data that we just had right here, and we'll start from there. Sorry, everyone, for that little hiccup. So currently, we are developing geographic information systems to show which areas in the community can be good candidates for large-scale buyouts. Existing development that can benefit from flood retrofit mitigation, and areas that could possibly be rezoned based on those high, medium, and low risk categories that we defined. And we are also going to be doing this same exercise, not just for the special flood hazard area, which is the 1% annual chance flood zone, but we are also going to look at the 0.2% annual chance flood zones, which are the 500-year flood, and also looking at a tool that the Nature Conservancy has developed, which is called the Active River Area, which is not obviously the regulatory floodplain, but looking at as potential areas of flood risk. Moving into the recovery plan and where other potential plans may coincide. Long-term recovery planning is similar to comprehensive planning in the breadth of topics that must be addressed, such as land use, infrastructure, and housing. However, instead of setting goals and policies for 10 to 20 years of incremental community development, the recovery plan is intended to restore and redevelop the community in a compressed time frame from a few years to ideally no more than 10. There are opportunities to include a recovery component in a locally adopted comprehensive plan via the natural hazards or safety element. This element may include proposed long and short-term hazard mitigation goals, policies, and actions enhancing long-term safety against future disasters. There are also opportunities to include recovery in local codes, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. Overall, a community can take on other tasks if the capacity for developing a recovery plan is insufficient. So in this visual, you can see where there are other opportunities to include the recovery element, again, if creating a standalone recovery plan is not possible. And again, this image is taken from the APA document, Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation. Moving on to a discussion of the Model Recovery Ordinance. The purpose of the Model Recovery Ordinance is to provide the legal authority for actions commonly found useful in expediting recovery, together with emergency powers protecting public health and safety and fostering desired beneficial long-term recovery outcomes. So what you see before you is a project briefing paper, which is available again through APA, about the pre-event recovery ordinance, which can be used alone or alongside the planning for post-disaster recovery next generation. There are several brief PDFs that are ideal handouts for meetings with officials and the general public. And you can have that link too for the full model recovery ordinance at the bottom of your screen. So I encourage everyone to take a look at these documents. They're very interesting and applicable to many components of the hazard mitigation planning process, and you can customize them to fit the needs of your particular community. In front of you is an outline of what the structure of the model recovery ordinance is. Again, it provides an adjustable template for organized local action to facilitate post-disaster recovery, accelerate restoration of public and private sector services, and intervene to preserve public safety and community resources in the interests of beneficial long-term recovery. The ordinance provides a structured approach to pre-event planning for post-disaster recovery consistent with emerging recovery best management practices. Specifically, it is designed for adoption by the local governing body before a disaster happens, as well as ongoing updating and amendment as needed. And there are 3 sections of the ordinance that I just wanted to talk about. Again, this ordinance can be is adjustable, and so certain sections can be used and incorporated with other local policies that a community may have. And again, I just want to just talk about 3 in particular. Temporary regulations, which provides authority to intervene on matters of private property development. Among these are provisions dealing with their duration, environmental clearances, debris clearance and hazard abatement, damage assessment and development moratoria, which we discussed earlier, temporary use permits, temporary repair permits, deferral of fees for repair and rebuilding permits, non-conforming uses and buildings, one-stop service centers, and the demolition of damaged historic buildings. The discussion of one-stop service center. The benefits to be gained for establishing a special one-stop center include accelerated information, integration of services, and expedited permitting. Setting up a specialist team working exclusively on repair and rebuilding permit issues has the added advantage of insulating normal development review from disruption by the recovery process and vice versa. And lastly, the emergency contractor and volunteer certification, which purpose is to reduce dishonest post-disaster predator activity by requiring contractor and volunteer certification in disaster cleanup and reconstruction. The local government verifies that contractors are properly registered and or licensed with the state contractors licensing agency of the state. Again, the full recovery ordinance is provided online, which I gave the link before on the following slide right here at the bottom. And you can read each of these sections at your convenience later on. Just wanted to bring out those 3 components. Why is some of this, the recovery ordinance and recovery planning, important? In particular, for New York State, we have a newly, well, it's about a year old now, law that was passed by Governor Cuomo, signed into law on September 22nd, 2014, to strengthen New York State preparedness for the effects of climate change and help protect communities against severe weather and sea level rise. The Act advances a number of important recommendations of the New York State 2100 Commission, which again the governor convened after Sandy to develop more resilient infrastructure systems across the state. The Act is the only legislation in the nation to require that climate impacts be a part of the planning, permitting, and funding process. And this is not just in the state's coastal areas, but across all 62 counties. Companies and communities seeking certain state permits or funding will use this data as well as forecasts covering heavy rainfall and storm surges to design projects to withstand the impacts of climate change and help protect surrounding neighborhoods. The standards would apply to smart growth assessments, siting of wastewater treatment plants and hazardous waste transportation, storage and disposal facilities, design and construction regulations for petroleum and chemical bulk storage facilities, and oil and gas drilling permits, and properties listed in the state's open space plan, as well as other projects. Moving on to the land use audit. Many communities are looking to the future and planning for resiliency, and we have discussed many local disaster mitigation tools such as the recovery plan and ordinance. It may seem overwhelming, but perhaps one of the best places to start is by conducting a land use audit. And here are several tools that I've been able to research. The first is the Safe Growth Audit. It's a proposed technique to improve safety from natural hazards during urban growth and development. There are no actual applications. However, it is possible to illustrate how such an audit might work by imagining it being applied in an existing situation where community growth faces significant hazards. The second is the Resilient Community Scorecard, which is made up of 12 checklists on topics ranging from energy to land use to business development. Each checklist has a series of questions. The third is the Flood Resilience Checklist, which helps communities identify opportunities to improve their resilience to future floods through policy and regulatory tools, including comprehensive plans, the Hazard Mitigation Plan, local land use codes and regulations, and non-regulatory programs implemented at the local level. The fourth is a New York State document, in particular the Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC. The desired outcome of climate-smart resiliency planning is for the municipal staff to work collaboratively across departments to recognize the opportunities to enhance community resilience in existing documents and to begin to create a set of integrated planning documents that identify vulnerabilities, assess risk, and mitigate hazards. And the last is the Coastal Resilience Index. After completing the Coastal Resilience self-assessment, the summary will help calculate the Resilience Index. The Resilience Index used in this self-assessment will be defined as low, medium, and high, or high. The rating will provide an idea of how long it may take your community to provide basic services and reoccupy homes and businesses after a disaster. So let's just look in particular at one of these checklists, which is the Flood Resilient Checklist, EPA, on the EPA website. This checklist can help communities identify opportunities to improve their resilience to future floods through policy and regulatory tools, including comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, and again, local land use codes and regulations. There are 5 different elements that will be reviewed. The first is the overall strategies to enhance flood resilience. Second, conserve land and discourage development in river corridors. Third, protect people, buildings, and facilities in vulnerable sediments. Fourth, plan for and encourage new development in safer areas. And the fifth, implement stormwater management techniques throughout the whole watershed. Completing this checklist is the first step in assessing how well a community is positioned to avoid and/or reduce flood damage and to recover from floods. If a community is not yet using some of these strategies listed in the checklist and would like to, the policy options and resources are listed in the Planning for Flood Recovery and Long-Term Resilience in Vermont report, which can provide ideas for how to begin implementing these approaches, again, through the EPA's website. And you can search for Flood Resilience Checklist and/or Planning for Flood Recovery and Long-Term Resilience in Vermont. Moving on to floodplain ordinances. Many, if not most, communities in the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, have enacted a separate ordinance that includes all the NFIP regulatory requirements, usually based on a FEMA or state model. Federally backed flood insurance is available to property owners once a community adopts and enforces floodplain management regulations. This is a good place to start in terms of local codes and the ability to increase resiliency. The advantage of having one ordinance that contains all floodplain development standards is that developers can easily see what is required of them, and FEMA and the state can easily see if your community has adopted the latest requirements. As addressed earlier, the disadvantage to a separate ordinance is that it may not be coordinated with other building, zoning, and/or subdivision regulations. Some communities have found that by adopting a standalone model, they adopt standards that are consistent or even contrary to the standards in other regulations. So again, ensuring consistency in your local codes is the first step in establishing resiliency. The Floodplain Ordinance will also require the community to adopt the flood maps, profiles, and other regulatory flood data provided by FEMA. The ordinance must have a development permit process. Construction standards are the meat of the ordinance. It should cover all of the NFIP standards, which are codified in Code 44 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, and additional regulatory standards required by the state or that the community deems appropriate. The community must officially designate one person responsible for administering the ordinance. A local floodplain administrator might be an existing local staff person, such as the building inspector, community zoning official, engineer, or planner. And the regulations need to provide a way for people to appeal or request a variance when they feel that the construction standards are overly harsh or inappropriate. There are several actions that a community can take to increase resiliency through its floodplain ordinance, such as higher regulatory standards, which are additional requirements that increase the level of protection provided to floodplain development. The first is freeboard, which again is a factor of safety expressed in feet above a flood level for purposes of floodplain management. In New York State, per our residential building code, we have a 2-foot freeboard. But freeboard is not required by NFIP standards, so you will have to check with your own individual state building code. Communities are encouraged to adopt at least a 1-foot freeboard to account for the 1-foot rise built into the concept of designated a floodway and the encroachment requirements where floodways have not been designated. Freeboard also results in significantly lower flood insurance rates due to lower flood risk. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, a community may wish to decrease the 50% threshold to a lower number, such as 30% of the building's value, to determine when substantial improvement or substantial damage requirement takes effect. Thus, you are bringing more non-compliant structures up to current NFIP standards. Again, lowering that substantial improvement and substantial damage threshold from 50, which is the NFIP standard, down to our lower threshold. Again, bringing more non-compliant structures into compliance. The third is looking at critical facilities. Requiring protection for critical facilities serves several purposes. It reduces threats to life and health. It reduces damage to vital public facilities. It reduces pollution of floodwaters by hazardous materials, and it ensures that the facilities will be operable during most flood emergencies. The NFIP regulations do not have any provisions for critical facilities, which includes hospitals, fire, and police stations, other than what is required of all buildings that are constructed in the 100-year flood zone. So by prohibiting critical facilities in the 100-year flood zone, or the SFHA, is a higher regulatory standard a community could pursue. The last is protection of floodplain storage capacity. The flood insurance studies assumes that when the entire riverine floodplain is filled outside of the floodway, which is the most dangerous part of the flood zone, the 100-year flood zone, an increase of up to 1 foot in the base flood elevation will occur at the location of the encroachment. An encroachment is any type of development that enters the 100-year flood zone, or the Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA. Some communities may wish to avoid that potential increase and to also make certain that an encroachment does not result in increased flood elevations upstream or downstream of the development by requiring developments that encroach into the floodplain to provide compensatory flood storage. So essentially what you're doing is the volume of space occupied by the authorized fill or structure shall be compensated for and balanced by a hydraulically equivalent volume of excavation taken from the BSE at or adjacent to the development site. So what you bring in to an area, you have to also take out to keep that, to not increase flood elevations upstream or downstream. Same thing with wetland mitigation. If you take out wetlands, you need to replace them somewhere else, same type of concept. Okay, moving into the final, which is an example or a tool for flood resiliency, which is the community rating system. The NFIP's community rating system, CRS, is a possible solution to reduce the damage, disruption, and public and private costs that result from flood problems. CRS is a voluntary incentive program that recognizes communities for enforcing floodplain management activities that exceed the minimum NFIP requirements. Any community that is in full compliance with the NFIP may apply to join the CRS. CRS credit points are earned for a wide range of floodplain management activities, which are organized under 4 categories: public information activities, the second, mapping and regulations, the third, flood damage reduction activities, and the fourth, warning and response. Communities apply for a CRS classification and are awarded credit points that reflect the impact of these activities. Similar to fire insurance rating, the CRS uses a class rating system to determine the premium discount for policyholders. All communities start out with a class 10 rating, which provides no discount, then range from 5%, which is a class 9, to a maximum of 45%, which is a class 1. As a community engages in additional CRS credited actions, increased NFIP policy premium discounts are available. So here, right here is an image that shows the amount of credit points that are required for each CRS class. Again, you enter as a class 9, and so if you have a policyholders that are located in the special flood hazard area, which again is the 1% annual chance or the 100-year flood zone, as a class 9 community, they would receive a 5% premium reduction. And it would go, as you move up categories, up to a 45%. I think the most popular CRS class is about a 7 or a 6. We will briefly go through the different creditable activities, which are, again, the points are awarded for engaging in any of the 19 activities organized under those 4 previously mentioned categories. And I just wanted to mention that keeping FEMA elevation certificates on all new buildings and substantial improvements that are made in the special flood hazard area, and FEMA floodproofing certificates and V-zone certificates are a prerequisite for joining the CRS. So that type of documentation is a prerequisite for just joining the CRS program. So here in front of you are the public information activities, which are the 300 series. And we have the 400 series, 500, and the 600 series. The CRS provides uniform minimum credit for certain state laws, regulations, and standards that support floodplain management and have effectively reduced flood damages. So I can briefly talk about what uniform minimum credits we have in New York State. There are several activity areas where a community may earn points for enforcing state mandates. For example, complying with the state pollutant discharge elimination system, SPEEDI's general permit for construction activities may award communities with points for erosion and sediment control regulation and for water quality regulations. Credit for state-mandated erosion and sediment control or water quality falls under Activity 450, which you can see there as stormwater management. It's provided only if the state mandate exceeds the requirements for a national pollutant discharge and elimination system permit. And in New York State, our Speedies construction and MS4 programs contain requirements that are more stringent than the federal requirements, in particular, the requirement to implement green infrastructure. There are also points awarded for the New York State Dam Safety Program, which provides up to 45 points, which would be awarded under the 600 series. So I encourage all communities to look at the CRS resources webpage, which is crsresources.org, and there is a tab that you can click and look up your state and see the uniform minimum credits that are available for, again, for communities that enforce what the state mandates, and of course they're different for every state. And in New York State, with the Speedies construction permit and a lot of the water quality regulations, many communities could pick up a lot of points for, again, the stormwater management activity if they do a good job of enforcing the permit and keeping good documentation and record keeping of all of those activities. A community can obtain the current and potential dollar savings for all 10 classes ISO CRS specialist. The ISO CRS specialist is an employee of the Insurance Services Offices, ISO, FEMA's CRS management contractor. The name and telephone number of the ISO CRS specialist for each state are listed on the CRS resources webpage, which again is crsresources.org. And what you see in front of you is this cost-benefit analysis, or the CRS what-if table. And this is a good tool to use if a community is interested in perhaps applying to the CRS program to see or to help determine the cost savings to the flood policyholders in the community versus what the cost of administering a CRS program or participation of the local program in comparison to the overall tax base. And this is a community in our 9-county region. And again, you can look at, you should be able to get this information from your ISO specialist, or you can likely, you may likely get this information from your state coordinating agency for the NFIP, which in New York State is the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. And again, what this what-if table is going to show you, it looks kind of fuzzy, but if you can see, PIF is policies in force, and so at this particular time, which changes often, policy information changes every month, and you can also get current policy information either from your state coordinating agency of the NFIP, or if you go onto the FEMA website and you do a search for NFIP policy statistics, you should be able to get the current number of policies in force for a community. And so in this case, there are 44 flood insurance policies in force, and you can see at each level how much of an insurance reduction, whether it be per policy or per community. So if this community were interested in participating in the CRS program and they wanted to get in at a class 9, which is that first class, the savings to the policyholders in the community would be $2,000. That's that first category right there. And so the question is, can that community administer that program, that local floodplain management program in the CRS for under $2,000? And if they could, then it would be a good investment for the community in terms of providing a service for not only the policyholders in the community, but also the tax base in general. Again, participating in the CRS is not generally just about having cheaper flood insurance. In general, there are other added values of participating in the CRS program, such as just overall good floodplain management, as well as a tool for flood and coastal resilience and improvement to public safety and natural resource and things like that. So again, participating in the CRS program is a tool for flood and coastal resilience. There are many benefits to enhanced floodplain management via the CRS program. Again, as I mentioned, public safety, property loss reduction, open space and natural resource protection, and better post-disaster recovery. CRS also provides a measure of performance, and for the purposes of flood resiliency, serves as a baseline for objective related conditions that can be measured again in the future to determine if progress has been made towards reducing flood vulnerability, and as a way to measure the disaster recovery process. So if a community is enforcing its minimum flood development regulations and has a compliant floodplain management program, CRS is a great tool to build the program and increase resiliency because it is a national program with readily available guidance documents, worksheets, and tools, and other resources. And by building up its floodplain activities, a community will be better able to bounce back or return to normalcy after a flood disaster. Okay, and that pretty much winds up my presentation today on planning for flood recovery and long-term resilience. And we can open it up to questions if we have any.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And everyone, make sure that you type your questions that you have in the questions chat box function. I would like to introduce our questions moderator. Today, the facilitator will be Art Buckley. And Art is employed by the County of Wyoming, New York, and as its county planner. Mr. Buckley has over 25 years of experience in community planning and environmental consulting. A significant portion of his public and private practice has involved agricultural and open space preservation in Western New York and the Finger Lakes. His professional services include community development, comprehensive planning, public participation, watershed and local waterfront revitalization, zoning, brownfield redevelopment, and grant writing. He has extensive environmental consulting experience, including environmental impact assessment and mitigation, site selection, and environmental testing and monitoring. Art is a member of Wyoming County's Planning Board, Ag and Farmland Protection Board, and serves on the Wyoming County Soil and Water Conservation District. Art is, he sits on the board of directors of the Upstate New York chapter of APA, and he's also the chapter's professional development officer. So Art, I'm going to just kind of verbally turn it over to you to get the Q&A rolling.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everybody. I guess the first question we have is, should planners consider, analyze, and prepare for a very large-scale comprehensive cyber attack or collapse if the World Wide Web, because when this eventually occurs, function of global, national, and regional local systems related to communications, economic activity, and the infrastructure functions will be rendered largely inoperable, particularly over the course of time. Flood control mechanical infrastructure systems, for example, the flood control pumps in New Orleans and New York City, are dependent on functioning World Wide Web.
Well, that seems like it would be something that may be undertaken through a emergency management office, and that is really dependent on the types of disasters that a community may deem as being high or low risk. And again, it varies by community. So again, I can only speak to what I know here in our region, but for each of the counties in our region, they perform, again, what I mentioned earlier, a hazard mitigation plan, which is required through the Disaster Mitigation Act. And through that planning process, they identify natural and or man-made disasters and ways to mitigate those disasters and those actions. And so having that type of a man-made disaster, which you're talking about with the World Wide Web and Internet, which again is a very good point, would be handled through that planning process. And if that particular jurisdiction or political subdivision, in which our case would be the county, they would rank those disasters as being high or low risk, and then determine from there what other sorts of planning processes would help address those types of electronic disasters. And again, it would be pretty much declared high or medium or low risk by that particular jurisdiction through the hazard mitigation plan, and then again any of those supporting planning processes that would need to be looked at further for that particular issue.
Thank you. If a community is just getting started, where would you recommend they start among all of these various resources?
That's an excellent question. And my recommendation would be, and it seems very basic, but it's really important actually, is are you currently doing all that you can do with your current regulations? From my experience, when we undertake a lot of these hazard mitigation planning processes, a lot of communities are not even aware that they have a local floodplain ordinance that they are enforcing, which is sometimes unsettling. It may just be because flooding doesn't occur very often, or in our case, a lot of times communities we're down to the very local level here in New York State, so local jurisdictions sometimes do not have the manpower to do everything, especially when it comes to code enforcement. So that's why I like to say, look through your current code, your current regulations, your zoning subdivision. Again, look for that local floodplain ordinance, which again triggers, it basically is a community's acknowledgement that they are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program and that there is a potential risk for flood disaster to occur in a community. And again, it enables residents in that particular community to purchase federally backed flood insurance. I would recommend that communities go and make sure to see what they have on the books and read their law and make sure they're doing all they can do under their current regs. And before you go ahead and start to add or to add more restrictive standards, or to even add other types of areas such as climate change or sea level rise or climate adaptation or green infrastructure, things like that. Make sure you're enforcing your current stuff.
All right, next question is, what kind of resiliency activities is GFLRPC doing for coastal communities?
That's another excellent question. Right now, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is performing some education and outreach about to every county, so every county in New York State, all 62 counties, on floodplain management, and for those coastal areas,
including the Great Lakes.
Yes, the coastal erosion hazard area information. So essentially, every state that has a coastal zone through Congress has been required to develop some type of a coastal erosion, a coastal management area type of jurisdiction. And in New York State, that's called a CEHA, which is a coastal erosion hazard area. And so in the Great Lakes area, there is a program called the CEHA program, and there are communities that are either a certified community, which means they enforce their own coastal erosion regulations, which are consistent with the state requirement, the state law, or a coastal community can defer that back to DEC and have them be a DEC regulated community. So there are Seahawk communities that are local or DEC authorized or DEC regulates themselves. And I had just participated in some of that training, and we are just getting involved with working with communities to see where we can provide more of an inter-municipal cooperation for coastal erosion hazard areas in lieu of the fact that some mapping of the coastal erosion hazard areas will be basically brought out into the future at some point. Right now the maps that the communities are working with are based in the 1980s, and so when those public information workshops and those maps become available, there will be public information workshops, and I anticipate that we will be assisting in some capacity when that does happen.
Then our next question is, during FEMA recovery ops, funding is provided for repairs of a structure up to 50% of market value, after which they would pay for replacement. If the threshold is lowered by a local jurisdiction, could this jeopardize FEMA funding that would otherwise be limited to repairs below 50% of market value?
Wow, that's an excellent question, and I have to say I do not know the answer to that, but I would have to imagine that since this is a that option of lowering the threshold is actually an area of is that higher regulatory standard that FEMA itself actually recommends that communities pursue. It's not in their, again, it's not the minimum standards, but if a community wants to do that, that's one of their higher regulatory standards that they recommend. And so you actually can get awarded credit points in the CRS program for higher regulatory standards, and I believe that is class, let me just look really quickly, higher regulatory standards, yes, is activity 430, and so at this point I would recommend that that answer to be the answer to that question to be researched further. There's actually documentation. Again, if you go to FEMA website and you search for, they have these technical bulletins. I imagine that that question might be answered in that technical bulletin that deals with higher regulatory standards. Again, that would be activity 430, higher regulatory standards. And that question might also be answered in another technical bulletin, which deals with how a community declares a substantial damage or substantial improvement, and that's another separate technical bulletin. So those two bulletins might actually get at that answer because I do not know that answer myself personally. That's the first I've heard of that particular grant award program. But again, I have to assume that since this is one of FEMA's recommendations for higher regulatory standards, that it must somehow work out when it comes to that determination of substantial damage or improvement. So that's what I recommend.
The next question is, what are your recommendations for which project is most important to take when the community is wholly in a floodway or a floodplain? In other words, how does a community grow and economically prosper when its location is fully within a floodplain?
Well, again, I think there are doing an exercise like I had shown earlier with a project that we are doing here in Western New York with the Nature Conservancy, and looking at those flood zones, the regulatory the floodway, the regulatory floodplain, the SFHA, and then looking at the building footprints and where they fall within those flood zones, and seeing if you can tier those particular areas in terms of which buildings are pre-firm, meaning that they were built before that flood insurance rate map was adopted by the community. Those are going to be the most at-risk buildings. And what are their assessed values? Is there any way that there's any type of acquisition that can occur? Is that even possible? But again, the best way to deal with those high-risk areas are to see if you can buy them out and return them to green space. Again, when it comes to and then looking at other types of uses, the medium and low risk areas. Are there flood retrofit options that can be done? Meaning if there are, again, buildings that are in the special flood hazard area that are maybe not as high risk, maybe they're not pre-firm, but they're not, there are things that can be done in terms of reducing the risk or even lowering their flood insurance premiums, such as installing flood vents in the areas below the base flood elevation, so letting those high hydraulic or the hydrostatic forces not to occur on a building, but letting the flood waters rush in and then rush out could lower flood insurance premiums. Also elevating mechanical equipment, such as any of your utilities for the home, bringing them out of the basement, elevating them higher. Those are flood retrofit types of projects. Also, I have heard of communities here in Western New York that have actually filled in their basement, meaning that those areas that are below the base flood elevation are being filled in, so not usable space any longer. Again, that obviously requires a lot of engineering to go into knowing exactly what type of fill to remove that lowest elevated that lowest floor that's below the base flood elevation. That's another flood retrofit idea that can be done for those type of medium risk properties. And obviously the number one is to elevate that structure, but if elevating a structure is not possible, again, installing flood vents or elevating the utilities itself is a way to look at reducing that risk. But also just talking about some of those higher regulatory standards, again, as long as you are not taking away, you're not denying all economic use of the property, and as long as construction standards are for the level of the hazard, you can adopt some of those higher regulatory uses if your community is wholly within a special flood hazard area. You just don't want something where a taking could occur, because you're basically rendering, you're denying all economic use of that particular land. So there are uses that are better for a flood zone. Again, if you can remove residential uses, if you can do more like an agricultural use or recreational uses, those are types of uses that would be more resilient to flood damage. Again, residential would not be. But again, you have to consider, are those flood retrofit types of solutions, could they easily solve some of the cases where those buildings are in the special flood hazard area? And again, as long as regulatory standards are reasonable and tied to the hazard and support public objectives, those restrictive NFIP regulations are not considered a taking. Again, you're allowing there to be development in the floodplain, but you are specifying the types of construction specifications that need to occur.
Our next question is, can a single structure contain both a commercial use below and a residential use above within a floodplain?
You still there, Art?
Yep, still here. Did you hear my question? Hello? Jamie, did you hear the previous question?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going. It's Christine. I'm not sure what's going on.
Christine.
It shows that she's still here. I'm not sure why we're not hearing her voice all of a sudden.
Right.
Well,
I'm not hearing anything.
Oh, are you there?
Jamie, are you there? I feel like the guy in the cellular commercial. You know, can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? Well, since it's almost 2:30 anyway, so I guess let's just, I think, go ahead and wrap up. And for those folks that didn't get their questions answered, feel free to email or call Jamie. Well, maybe don't call her. Funny. So anyway, I'm sorry, everyone. I cannot explain. Sometimes we just get technical issues, and we just do what we can to try to make the best of it. So thanks, everyone, for sticking around. Again, just as a reminder that a PDF of the presentation will be available on our webpage after the session, and we will have this up on our YouTube channel too as a video recording. So thank you to Jamie, if you can hear us, and
Christine,
Art for facilitating, and the New York Upstate Chapter.
I'm back.
Oh, you are back.
Can you hear us?
When did I leave?
Well, after your explanation of it just kind of cut out.
Yeah, let's keep going then. I mean, we have maybe another 5 minutes.
Okay.
So for those that are still on the line, you might as well ask another question or two.
Great, thank you. Can a single structure contain both a commercial use below and a residential use above within the floodplain?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the short answer.
That is a really good question. Of course. I mean, that's not going to, that's, as long as the structure is built to the construction specifications in the floodplain regulations. So the floodplain regulations are going to be different than your zoning requirement. So that seems to be, there's a use requirement and then there's the floodplain. So they're not the same. So as long as, and I would believe in this specific application, because there is a residential component to it, that I would imagine the floodplain administrator, who is again responsible for enforcing the floodplain code, because there is a resident application, would want that structure to be built to the residential code and the floodplain requirements that go along with that. But I'm not a code enforcement officer, and I don't know if that would be how they would interpret it, but that's my interpretation. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Is there a really good example of a CRS hazard mitigation plan? I mean, something that would give you the most points possible, for instance, you know, when
So the question is, could you get points in the CRS program for having a planning document?
Yeah, I think what they're looking for is what model or example of a CRS hazard mitigation plan would present a community with the most points possible for their plan.
Okay, that's an excellent question. And if you are, again, thinking about the CRS program, the best thing to do is to go right to the CRS Resources website, crsresources.org, and that would be categorized under floodplain management planning, which is activity 510. And that is under category 3, flood damage reduction activities. And if you actually go to the CRS resources website and you click on activity 510, it will actually show you how you can get the most points for having a floodplain management plan. And it's a 10-step process. And if you can document all those 10 steps, then you can maximize the points under that category. And again, all of that information is provided to you in on that website in that document area.
Thank you. And our next question, is there a model ordinance for temporary emergency regulations for disaster recovery?
I am not aware that there is one, but that doesn't mean, obviously, that it doesn't exist. I would take a look at the, again, the APA's Model Recovery Ordinance, because it actually spells out each section of the recovery ordinance, and not only does it give the model regulatory language, but it also provides a small synopsis of why that particular item is included, or its relevancy or importance. I also recommend looking at different like search engines that deal with that research model recovery ordinances. So, for example, I can think off the top of my head, PACE Land Use Law has a website where you can search for different types of model ordinances. I think maybe even Columbia might have a website that deals with, it might be more geared towards green construction, but I'm not completely sure. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that what the type of model ordinance that you're talking about, and this is something that I believe the Department of State in New York State, again via the New York State Community Risk and Resiliency Act, they are developing model legislation that deals with climate change adaptation and zoning laws, and I don't know what types of model ordinances they are coming up with, but I imagine that these some model moratorium ordinances may actually be developed. And we work, the regional planning councils throughout New York State work very well with the Department of State on these types of issues, and that is actually a comment that I can bring to them as a recommendation to develop that type of recovery ordinance. And so I recommend to participants that are still on the line here listening to check back at Department of State, New York State Department of State website, and when those types of model ordinances will be developed, they most certainly will be put on the website.
Thank you, Jamie. I guess that's the last question that we have so far. So,
okay.
Christine?
Great. Thank you. And it's 2:30, so it's perfect timing. All right. So this time we actually will close up shop. Thanks again to Jamie and to Art and the New York Upstate Chapter, and to everyone for staying on the line with us today during our technical difficulties. And again, everything will be up on YouTube and our webpage shortly. So everyone have a great weekend, and we will talk next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Again, I'm really sorry about all of the difficulties.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.